The honourable member for Sherwood Park. I almost said Sherwood Forest again. Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some sympathies for Robin Hood, but I am not from Sherwood Forest. Mr. Speaker, that was exciting to my NDP friends I know who maybe think of themselves as more the party of Robin Hood. But I gather that the House will provide opportunities for discussion of such matters in the near future. In the meantime, I want to raise a very important issue of international human rights, a subject on which we may even find some rare agreement with my friends in the corner. In the context of this motion, I want to say that we have the honour of recognizing the presence in Canada, and in particular here in Ottawa, of Mrs. Kara-Murza, the wife of Vladimir Kara-Murza. She is here advocating for the release of her husband and indeed to promote justice and human rights. Vladimir Kara-Murza is likely among the most well-known heroes inside of Russia, who joins others who are fearlessly standing for freedom and human rights. Mr. Kara-Murza is currently imprisoned. He has survived multiple assassination attempts. I salute Mr. Kara-Murza's courage, as well as Mrs. Kara-Murza for his work in magnifying these issues, and I join my voice to others in calling for Mr. Kara-Murza's release. Now, in the spirit of recognizing the courageous Russian opposition figures who are standing against the invasion of Ukraine and also standing against human rights abuses taking place inside of Russia, I am seeking the concurrence of the House to a motion that I moved at the Immigration Committee earlier this year. That was a motion to oppose the invasion of Ukraine launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin, to recognize the courageous Russian opposition and really the importance of recognizing that opposition in the larger context of what we are seeing in the world today, and also to have immigration measures put in place to provide support and assistance to these brave Russian human rights defenders. The motion that I put forward at the Immigration Committee and that I seek the concurrence of the House to is as follows. We condemn the continuing attack on Ukraine ordered by Russian President Vladimir Putin. We recognize that a growing proportion of the Russian people are bravely resisting and opposing this attack, and we call on the Government of Canada to develop measures to support Russian dissidents, human rights defenders, and conscientious objectors within the military who are seeking to urgently flee Russia, while ensuring, of course, that necessary security precautions are taken. So that is the fifth report of the Standing Committee on Immigration. It was adopted by the Immigration Committee on April the 4th. And of course, the context has significantly shifted since then and arguably made the role of the Russian opposition even more important as we see increasing human rights violations inside of Russia, as we see in response to defeats on the battlefield that Russia is facing, the continuing brutalization of the Russian people and of the Ukrainian people by the Russian regime, throwing untrained, unprepared conscripts at the front lines, simply, in a sense, trying to pile up corpses of their own people in hopes of, in a vain hope of stopping the Ukrainian advance. So we're seeing how this brutal regime has no regard for the lives of the Ukrainian people. It also has no regard for the lives of the Russian people. And estimates are now that more people have sought to flee Russia than were actually involved in the invasion. Quite a number, quite a magnitude, and we're seeing the rallies, the acts of resistance by people in Russia that are trying to call out what the regime is doing, who are defending the rights of Ukrainians and who are also defending their own rights to choose and shape their own future. Now, I will have more to say about the Russian opposition, but let me just start here by making a few comments about, in particular, in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the things that Canada needs to do right away to defend to support Ukraine. Ukraine is winning, Ukraine is succeeding, but they need continuing support from Canada and other Western allies. And I would say primarily we need to think in two areas, in the area of weapons support and in the area of energy security. In the area of weapons support, we've had various voices from Ukraine, including very forthright comments on the weekend from a Ukrainian member of parliament saying Canada needs to do more in terms of supplying weapons. And there seems to be a hesitation in terms of supplying vitally required weapons from Canada. Canada is falling behind in terms of support for Ukraine. More is required in terms of supplying weapons, and we in the official opposition will continue to push the government to give Ukraine all of the weapons supplies it needs. There have been other voices connecting to the government that have called on them to do more. Canada's own ambassador, Bob Ray, to the United Nations has called out the government and said, in his view, that the government needs to be doing all that is required to supply Ukraine with the weapons that it needs. So more engagement from this government in terms of supplying weapons. We were late to the party on that in many respects. We should have been supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine prior to the invasion. We should be doing more now. So in the area of weapons, also in the area of energy security. Right away after the invasion, Conservatives had a motion in this House that was recognizing the critical role of energy security in this conflict, saying that Canada needed to seize the moment to correct what have been 7 years of failed energy policy, to ramp up our energy exports to Europe, to supply Europe with the energy support and security it requires. And we recognize the failures in terms of developing the energy sector from the government over the last 7 years, but now would have been the time to recognize those failures of policy and to correct them. And yet the government is continuing to undermine efforts to expand energy development and export in response to these circumstances. And this is critical, Madam Speaker, because most of the world's democracies, as it happens, are geographically small and more populous nations that therefore tend to rely more on imports of natural resources, especially energy resources from other countries. Canada is relatively unique in the democratic world as being a geographically large, less densely populated country, rich in natural resources. And I believe that gives us a special vocation within the community of democratic nations. We have a responsibility to supply like-minded democratic allies with the kinds of energy resources that they require in order to have that security. And we should step up and fulfill that role. Because if we aren't supplying energy, providing that security, then our partners in Europe, but also in the Asia-Pacific, other democratic countries, will find themselves forced to be more reliant on more hostile, undemocratic sources of those energy resources. And we've seen how failures in Canadian energy policy to support our allies have left those allies more dependent on hostile powers like Russia, and therefore potentially more vulnerable to energy blackmail. Now, we can't reverse these 7 years of policy failures overnight, but the first step should be to recognize the problem. I note the Deputy Prime Minister has made comments about the need to get serious about this issue, and I would hope she would be even more explicit about acknowledging that her government has failed on these issues, and the current circumstances underline the need to correct that failure as quickly as possible. So when it comes to supporting Ukraine in general, Canada needs to step up in the area of weapons, and Canada needs to step up in the area of energy. But in particular, we also can step up as it relates to this motion. We can step up in our support of the Russian opposition, recognizing the critical role that they are playing and that they are going to play. Now, Madam Speaker, in some ways, it's difficult to know all of the dynamics that are going on inside of Russia. We can speculate about what may be happening, what may be being contemplated, what different figures that are opposed to the regime in Russia are doing. We can speculate about those things, but I think we can also learn the lessons of history and draw from those lessons in our understanding of what might be going on and the critical role that other countries can play in offering that support. As I've told the House before, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and I've done a lot of reading about the kind of anti-Nazi German resistance that was in place really throughout the Nazi era, but especially towards the end of the Second World War, that culminated in but continued after the Valkyrie plot. And I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn for understanding the kind of resistance that it can exist to authoritarian or totalitarian regimes and how it manifests itself. And I would just commend a few books to the consideration of honorable members on that era. I recently read Disobeying Hitler, German Resistance After Operation Valkyrie by Randall Hansen. And what he describes is the multifaceted nature of resistance that can take place in a totalitarian system. Sometimes you have people that are speaking out or protesting, and we've seen some of that in Russia. You have forms of military resistance seeking political change. But you also, and Hansen speaks in particular about this in his book, about how disobedience is a form of resistance. When you have a totalitarian regime giving orders to the military, you can then have sometimes instances where those orders are ignored or massaged to try to minimize the destruction, minimize the loss of life. And he chronicles many examples of this at the end of the Second World War, where low-level forms of resistance or disobedience by people within the German army, disobeying orders that had come from high command, preserved infrastructure, preserved lives, and had some degree of positive effect. So we can hope that what we will see more of going forward inside of Russia is this kind of multi-dimensional resistance, where you have people that are in the military that are maybe ordered to engage in atrocities or to respond in particular ways, who are ignoring, massaging those orders, maybe who are surrendering without authorization, who are taking these kinds of simple steps to try to resist the oppression of the Russian regime and its violence towards Ukraine, but also towards its own people. I think the other thing that I certainly found interesting about reading stories of the anti-Nazi German resistors is that many of them were motivated by a deep sense of nationalism. That is, they loved their country, they were committed to the honor and dignity of their country, and they felt that their country was being betrayed by the regime. These figures that were key in the German resistance, people like Admiral Canaris, they had this sense of loving their country more than their government did. And they also came from elite circles. Many of them were in positions where they were positions of privilege and power within the system that gave them the means to resist. And that existed alongside everyday people that were protesting in the streets in select moments, that were maybe distributing materials that were critical of the regime. And these things. In the case of the anti-Nazi German resistance, they didn't fulfill their full potential, but they had an impact. They led to lives being saved, but they also, I think, provided the moral basis for what came next. They did manage to show the world that there was an other Germany, a different Germany that wasn't represented by the fascist regime. And I think we see a similar thing happening in Russia, where people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, their heroism, their resistance, their sacrifice, and that of many others, it shows the fact that there is a different Russia. There is a Russia represented by people who believe in freedom and democracy, but also who deeply love their country, who love their culture, and who don't buy into this fiction that somehow there's an inevitable antagonism between Russia and the West, that they recognize that values of freedom and democracy, recognition of universal human dignity, that these things are universal, and they want to see Russia have a government that embraces these ideas and principles. So we can recognize the value of the of the Russian opposition, the role it is playing, and the role that it must continue to play. So, in particular, then, what are we seeing right now? Because this motion, it was proposed on it was tabled in the House on April the 4th. We note, of course, that as I said, there are many things that we can't know about what may be going on inside of Russia, but we do see evidence, and we've heard evidence at the Foreign Affairs Committee and elsewhere that there are emerging cracks. There's been speculation about, for instance, would the military carry out an order in Russia to use a nuclear weapon in light of the devastating consequences that would no doubt have for Russia? Would such an order be the occasion for resistance? We can certainly hope that it would be. We can see how, in the face of Russia's further mobilization, drafting people that are outside of military age, people that are in some cases physically not fit for military service, drafting those people and forcing them towards the front line without anything resembling appropriate training. That this is rightly provoking a sense of resistance and frustration within Russia, that we have people protesting, people fleeing, and I think it's just really important for us to recognize in the context of this conflict that everybody involved is an individual. That people are responsible for their own choices and their own actions. And there are, of course, there's the regime itself. There are many people around it that are responsible for the evil actions that they are undertaking. And there are also people that are Russian who are opposed to that. And we need to then reflect on that and do all we can to support the Russian opposition. So Canada's engagement in response to the invasion of Ukraine, we need to be doing more in terms of weapons, in terms of energy policy, but also in terms of supporting the opposition. Now, this motion on April 4th, as I said, it was presented prior to that order for mobilization, and we're seeing all the more now in response to the resistance, the need for Canada to respond, and other countries to respond in offering that support. Now, I want to mention as well that this motion, of course, speaks to immigration measures. It comes to us from the Immigration Committee. It talks about offering channels of support in terms of immigration for Russian dissidents, human rights defenders who are fleeing. And for years, Conservatives have been advocating special supports in terms of immigration for human rights defenders. We've talked about it in the context of special programs for Hong Kong and other situations. And our contention in general is that those who have taken a stand, who have fought for human rights, and are as a result of it facing severe threats and persecution, that those people make great Canadians, that they can richly contribute to our country in terms of our understanding and appreciation for the values of freedom and democracy, and that we can provide those people with an opportunity to be safe here and a platform to continue their work and their advocacy. So this is one of the concrete measures that we're taking, and I know there's some controversy in other countries about the question of the number of people that are fleeing Russia and who should be able to come and so forth. I think it's important to underline that this motion speaks specifically to human rights defenders. It speaks specifically to those who wish to flee, who have been actively engaged in human rights work, who are active dissidents, who are active and clear as conscientious objectors. So this is the focus of the motion, and I think on that basis it should enjoy broad-based support in this House. And I hope members will be prepared to add their voice to this important motion, and that we'll be able to get this motion supported, voted on, adopted by all members. I think this House standing together to express its support for the Russian opposition, to express its recognition that the Putin regime does not represent the Russian people, and to recognize those brave Russians. Many may have private objections, but certainly to recognize those that have been vocal and public in opposing the regime in various ways. I think it would send a powerful signal if the Canadian House of Commons said, recognizing as part of this that we support the Ukrainian people in their resistance to Putin's tyranny, and we support the Russian people in their resistance to Putin's tyranny. I should say also the Belarusian people in their efforts to resist Putin's tyranny and other peoples that are affected by the violence of that regime. So this House of Commons, this government can and should do more, supplying weapons, energy security, and supporting the Russian opposition. I hope that we're able to send that strong message today in support for the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for that speech, and particularly for mentioning the visit to Ottawa of Evgenia Kara-Murza, who we had an opportunity to meet with last night, the wife of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who I had the chance to meet a few years ago through the World Movement for Democracy, and found to be a man of conviction, a man of courage, and one who's an inspiration to all of those in Russia who are fighting for freedom, for democracy, and fighting against tyranny and authoritarianism. I myself call for the immediate release of Vladimir Kara-Murza, and I would like to ask my colleague if he joins in that call. Thank you.
Well, the Honourable Member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, absolutely. I said it earlier, and I'll repeat the call, and I'm sure, I hope we'll hear from more members adding their voice to that. It's very much appreciated that Evgenia is here in Ottawa. I think it's really powerful for us members of Parliament to hear a personal story directly from someone, and I salute the courage of Vladimir Kara-Murza and of the many others that are speaking out. There are going to be many who have been murdered, who are imprisoned, whose names we will never know, sadly. But we honor their courage as well as that of Vladimir Kara-Murza calling for his release. I believe Mrs. Kara-Murza is going to be joining us at the Foreign Affairs Committee tomorrow as well, and we'll have an opportunity to hear her testimony on the record. I'm not sure if that's 100% confirmed. I hope I'm not telling tales out of school, but I hope more of the public will be able to hear directly during those hearings her testimony as well.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for bringing forward this motion. I'm a member of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, and we are in the midst of wrapping up our own study into Canada's security posture vis-a-vis Russia. We've also heard testimony about the need to protect Russian dissidents, how they can be a valuable source of information. But, you know, the security threats from Russia are multi-pronged. They're not only military, but also in the area of cybersecurity. We know that Russian criminal organizations are often working hand-in-hand with the Russian government to go after Canadian cybersecurity interests. And I'm just wondering if the member can comment on how maybe Russian dissidents who are in the cybersecurity field, who maybe have that intricate knowledge of Russian attacks against Canadian cybersecurity infrastructure, how that also may be a very valuable source of intelligence to help us fully understand the nature of the 21st century threats that are headed our way.
Member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Excellent question from my colleague. I think Canada has a lot of work to do when it comes to strengthening our cybersecurity response and our response to foreign state-backed interference in general, recognizing the complexity of that. Sometimes it's state actors, sometimes it's state-backed actors, and we need to, and I think we're being told by our security agencies that we need to improve our sophistication there. And this is one of, I think, many examples where human rights defenders from Russia and from other countries can significantly contribute to Canada. We talked about this in the context of the government's program for Hong Kong, where they said, okay, you have to be a new graduate, you have to meet all these criteria. And what we said at the time, and I believe the members' party was in agreement with us, was that anybody who has stood up, stuck their neck out, and fought publicly for human rights against an authoritarian regime, regardless of any other potential qualifications, that person will make a great Canadian who will be able to significantly contribute to our country. When someone has shown that level of courage and readiness for sacrifice, of course, many of these dissidents will bring particular information that will reflect their own expertise or their own area of work. But regardless, those that have been resistors to authoritarianism, those that have been brave human rights defenders, they make great Canadians, and we should be putting in place programs to, in particular, recognize and welcome these brave human rights defenders.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Saskatoon question, West.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my colleague for the excellent speech. It's a very important issue today. We just heard one of the impacts of the Russian war on the world is security or IT infrastructure. Another one is energy security. And think about Canada as having, the third largest reserves of oil and natural gas in the world. The German Chancellor who came to Canada looking for help for potential energy sources, and we couldn't provide, unfortunately. So I'm just wondering if the member has some comments about what Canada could and should be doing to help Europe as they deal with this issue in terms of our position as an energy power in the world.
Great question.
Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the member for his question and for his excellent work on the Immigration Committee, which adopted this motion, and always his hard work on the file. When it comes to the issue of energy security, look, this government has it backwards. They are granting a waiver to our sanctions to allow Canadian work to be done on a turbine for the export of Russian gas to Germany. We should be focused on building the infrastructure to have Canadian gas supplying Europe. Instead, we're not doing that, but we're supplying technology to facilitate the export of Russian gas to Europe. And we heard from Siemens representative yesterday at the Foreign Affairs Committee saying that not granting this waiver would actually have no impact on workers here in Canada, which completely contradicts what the government has said. The government's latest rationale was, well, this was about allowing this waiver of sanctions was about jobs in Canada, and Siemens, the company involved, directly contradicted that. So it remains a mystery to me why this government is facilitating and granting exceptions to sanctions to facilitate the export of Russian gas to Germany instead of focusing on building up the Canadian energy sector. It's not going to happen overnight. We've had 7 years of failed energy policy under this government, but now is the time to stop digging and try to get out of that hole, and for Canada to realize its vocation within the democratic world of providing our European allies, also our Asia-Pacific allies, with the energy security that will make them less dependent on authoritarian powers.
Comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm wondering why it is the member has chosen today in which we were supposed to be debating this morning the issue of Canada's environment. There's many concerns that Canadians have as a whole related to the environment. Bill S5 goes a long way in dealing with those concerns. What the member is wanting to talk about today could have just as easily been brought up by an opposition motion. Why is the Conservative Party choosing to prevent debate on S5 in favor of having this being debated as opposed to proposing an opposition day motion or requesting a take-note debate or introducing an emergency debate to the House? Why avoiding the discussion on our environment?
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Madam Speaker, the House has sat for 3 weeks thus far this fall. The government has not called Bill S25 on any of the days in those 3 weeks. The government has clearly demonstrated that S5 is not a priority for them, and I suppose he can talk to his House Leader about why the government hasn't chosen to prioritize this bill. But look, this issue of supporting the Russian opposition is critical. We felt that it was valuable and important to be able to have this debate at a time when Evgenia Kara-Murza is in Ottawa, is engaging in this advocacy and supporting the Russian opposition. This is an opportunity for all members to call for Vladimir Kara-Murza's release and to express our support for the Russian opposition. The government has many opportunities. Later today, they would have an opportunity to call whatever legislation is their priority. The government has most of the day available to them, but there are some limited opportunities that opposition has to raise priorities for us, and this is one opportunity where we've chosen to raise this important issue of supporting the Russian opposition in a nonpartisan way. We hope it gathers the support of all members.